My step-family sold me to a monster. Now I am the most feared Alpha King, beloved wife. There is an old saying in the borderlands where Soulweaver Marsh meets the Ashen Ridge. The monster at the door is never the one you should fear. Fear the hand that opens it. Soulweaver Ashvale had heard her grandmother say those words 100 times beside a dying fire, the old woman's knuckles white around a cup of black tea. She had not understood them then. She had been 6, and monsters were things with claws and red eyes, not men in pressed collars who smiled while they counted coins. She understood now. She was 22 years old, standing in the back of a tradesman's cart with her wrists loosely bound. A courtesy, the man driving had said, laughing just for show, wearing the only dress she owned that had no visible holes. Her stepfather had chosen it for her. He had wanted her to look presentable. He had wanted to get a good price. In her boot, pressed against her left ankle, was the only thing she'd managed to take when they'd pulled her from the house at dawn. A small brass compass, tarnished and cracked across the face, that had belonged to her mother. It did not point north anymore. It did not point anywhere. But it was warm against her skin, and she held that warmth inside her chest like an ember, because she would not cry in front of the man who had sold her. She did not know what waited at the end of the road. She had been told it was a monster. She had learned by now to question every door before she walked through it. Chapter 1. The Price of a Wolfless Girl. The cart ride took 4 hours. Soulweaver spent them watching the land change. The flat market town gray of Duskfen, where she had lived her stepfather Rennick's version of a life, cooking, cleaning, invisible, useful, gave way to black pine forest, and then to something older. The road became smooth stone beneath them, and the trees on either side grew enormous and deliberate, as though they had been placed there rather than grown. The air tasted different. Colder, cleaner, threaded with something wild that pressed against Soulweaver's skin like a second atmosphere. She had no wolf. She had known this since she was 14, the age at which every other young shifter in the borderlands felt the first stirring of their animal self. A pressure in the chest, a warmth behind the eyes, a sense of being doubled. She had waited and felt nothing. Her stepmother Dressla had made sure the entire town knew. Wolfless whispered in the market, in the square, in the pews of the moon chapel. As if it were a disease, as if it were something Soulweaver had done on purpose. Without a wolf, she could not shift. Without a shift, she had no pack ranking. Without ranking, she had no legal protections under the compact. She was, in the cold language of pack law, unregistered, which meant Rennick had been able to sell her, legally, as a household bondservant to clear a debt. He had told her this at breakfast, very calmly, the same way he told her the wood needed splitting. Her stepsister Velith had watched from the doorway with an expression that was mostly relief. The cart stopped at a gate. It was not the gate Soulweaver had expected. She had imagined something rusted and theatrical, a thing that creaked and dripped. Instead, the gate was iron set with bronze, the metal worked into shapes she gradually recognized as wolves mid-run, their bodies caught in permanent silent motion. They were beautiful. They were also very large, and the wall they were set into stretched in both directions until the trees swallowed it. "Thornvast Keep," said the iron letters above the arch. The driver spoke to a guard without getting down from the cart, exchanged a sealed letter for a pouch that clinked, and then reached back and unlocked Soulweaver's wrists without looking at her. "You're bought and delivered," he said. "Someone'll come." He drove away before the gate had finished swinging open. Soulweaver stood alone on the smooth stone road, her bound hair coming loose in the cold wind, her single bag at her feet. The compass pressed against her ankle. She did not reach for it. She straightened her spine instead, the way her grandmother had taught her. Stand as though the sky is resting on your shoulders, and you've decided to let it, and walked through the gate. Chapter 2. What They Called Him. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Alpha King Draveth Thornvast was 7 feet of terror in every version. He had ended the Pale War in a single night, and no one spoke of exactly how. He had executed 3 pack lords in 1 moon cycle. He communicated in silences that made grown wolves drop to their knees. He had not taken a mate in 40 years of rule, and the general consensus was that he did not want one, or had eaten the last one, or both. The woman who met Soulweaver at the inner courtyard was short, iron-haired, and radiating the practical energy of someone who had survived everything by being smarter than it. "Marette," she introduced herself, not extending a hand. She was holding a ledger. "Household keeper. You're the new bond servant from Duskfen." It wasn't a question. "Wolfless," the letter says. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you read?" Soulweaver blinked. "Yes." "Good. Half of them can't." Marit made a note. "The king's household runs on order. You'll have duties in the kitchen and the archive room, both. You'll stay in the eastern servant quarters. You'll not go to the upper west wing without an escort. You'll not speak to the king unless he speaks first." "Does he?" Soulweaver asked. "Speak?" Marit looked up from the ledger for the first time, and something like amusement crossed her weathered face. "Sometimes," she said, "when something interests him." The keep was nothing like Soulweaver's imagination had built. There were flowers in the courtyard, dark autumn ones, deep purple and near black, growing from stone cracks with the stubborn confidence of things that knew they belonged. The halls were warm. The servants moved with purpose rather than fear, nodding to each other, talking in low voices that sounded like colleagues rather than prisoners. She had expected a dungeon. She found a household. She was given a room with a real door that latched from the inside. She stood and looked at the latch for a full minute. Then she put her mother's compass on the narrow windowsill where she could see it from the bed, and she slept more deeply than she had in 2 years. Chapter 3. The Archive and the Silence. She did not see the Alpha King for 11 days. She did not mind. The archive room was a revelation. Floor-to-ceiling shelving, 2 entire walls of maps, a celestial chart painted directly onto the plaster that someone had been updating by hand, the stars marked in silver ink with dates beside them. She was supposed to be cataloging a box of correspondence that had been misfiled during the Pale War. She found herself reading every letter before she filed it. She was reading one, a field report from the war's final night, written in a hand so controlled it had clearly cost the writer enormous effort, when she became aware she was not alone. She did not hear him enter. She simply felt the air in the room change, as if the atmosphere had reorganized itself around a new gravitational center. Draveth Thornvast was not 7 feet tall. He was perhaps 6'4", which in a doorway was enough. He was dark-haired, iron-jawed, wearing no crown and no ceremony. Just a long black coat and the absolute stillness of a predator who had stopped moving because it had chosen to. His eyes were the color of frost on deep water, pale gray-blue, and they were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't parse. She was holding his war correspondence. She stood and set the letter carefully on the table. "I apologize. I shouldn't have been reading it. You've been putting them in order." His voice was low, precise, each word deliberate. Not loud, not booming. Quiet in the way that deep things were quiet. Chronologically by author. I can reorganize by event if that's more. By author is better. A silence. She became very aware of the dust motes in the archive light, the scratch of the trees against the outer wall, her own heartbeat. "You read quickly," he said. It wasn't a compliment or a criticism. It was an observation. She had the strange sense that this was a man who only stated things he found genuinely significant. "I have always read quickly," she said, then added before she could stop herself. "There was not always much else to do." His head tilted a fraction. The frost-gray eyes moved over her face with the methodical attention of someone reading a document that was more interesting than expected. Then he crossed to the far wall without another word, ran his finger along a row of spines, pulled a volume, and left. She stood in the altered air of his absence and noticed, with profound confusion, that she did not feel afraid. Chapter 4. What Grows in Cold Ground. He came back to the archive 4 days later, and then 3 days after that, and then the next afternoon. And then, with a consistency that Marit noticed and refused to comment on directly, but expressed through the eloquence of raised eyebrows, almost every day. He never said much. Sometimes he asked her what she'd found in the correspondence. Sometimes he simply read on the other side of the room while she worked. Once she was on the upper ladder reaching for a mishoused volume, and she knocked a stack from the shelf, and instead of the crash she expected there was a pause, and then the books were beside her on the shelf, neatly stacked, and he was already back at the table. "Thank you," she said from the ladder. "You would have caught them," he said. Not flattery, a statement of assessed fact, and she found it more warming than flattery would have been. She began to leave volumes she thought he'd find interesting on the table before she left each evening. Old treaties, a naturalist's survey of the Black Pine Forest, a history of the Moon Chapel that contradicted 3 things the chapel itself claimed to believe. He never mentioned them. They were always gone the next day, returned to the shelf, but with a strip of dark ribbon marking pages. She found herself reading those pages. She found herself thinking, while she slept, about what he had found in them worth marking. The cold wind arrived in earnest, and Marit gave her a second blanket without being asked. The flowers in the courtyard went dark and spiky, and looked more beautiful for it. Soulweaver was given a key to the archive, on a ring with her name scratched into the brass. She held the ring and thought about what it meant to be given a key in a place you'd been brought to as property. She went to find Marit. "What does it mean," she asked, "if the king gives someone an archive key?" Marit took a very long time consulting her ledger. "It's happened twice before," she finally said. The first was the war chronicler. He was there 14 years. A pause. The second was the king's mother. Soulweaver went back to the archive and sat down in the chair and stared at the letter she was supposed to be cataloging for a considerable time. Chapter 5. The Council and the Monster. She should have known it would not go unremarked. The 3 pack lords of the Thornvast Alliance had come for the seasonal council, and they arrived on a bitter morning with their entourages and their politics and their opinions, which they wore like armor. She heard their names from Marit: Lord Caskin of the Ridgepack, Lord Fennery of the Deepwood Compact, and Lord Vralt of the Salt Marsh, the youngest and sharpest-tongued of the 3. She encountered Vral outside the archive on the second day of council. He was perhaps 30, golden-haired, expensively dressed. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man cataloging something's value and finding it wanting. His eyes caught the key at her belt. "You're the Bond girl from Duskfen." His voice had a sweetness to it like rotted fruit. "The wolfless one. I heard you'd made yourself useful." She was carrying a stack of reference volumes. She did not set them down. "Good morning, my lord. The king has odd tastes." He stepped slightly into her path, not quite blocking her, not quite not. He always has, but a servant girl in the archive. A wolfless nobody from the borderlands. It's a peculiar indulgence. "I'll pass your architectural observations to the bookshelves," she said pleasantly, and walked around him. She heard him laugh behind her. Not a pleasant sound. She did not tell the Alpha King. There was nothing to tell. Nothing had happened. But 2 evenings later, when she was replacing the naturalist's survey after finishing it, Draveth spoke from his chair. "Vral approached you." Not a question. She stopped. "He was unkind about the archive." "He was unkind about you." She turned. He was watching her with that unreadable attention, his hands still around the volume in his lap. She had learned slowly to read small signals in his stillness, and he was very still now in the way that meant something was moving underneath. "He is not wrong that I'm wolfless," she said, "or borderlands, or bond-born. Those are facts." Facts? His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, a careful, restrained edge. "Tell me what you've read in the last 3 weeks." She blinked. 240 years of treaty correspondence, a naturalist's account that corrects 4 errors in the official forest survey, a history of the Moon Chapel that... What was in the field report? The one from the last night of the war. He had seen her with it 3 weeks ago. She met his frost-gray eyes. That the deciding factor was not force. It was the refusal of 16 villages to provide safe passage to the Pale Army. A choice that cost them, and that was never officially credited. A pause. I cross-referenced it with the compact records. Those 16 villages received no formal recognition. The silence was different this time. No one has read that correspondence in 40 years, he said. In 40 years of council, no lord has cross-referenced it. Perhaps they didn't think it important. Perhaps they did not think. He rose. He moved to the window, and the courtyard light caught the hard angle of his profile. Froldt is afraid of what cannot be ranked or priced. He has always been. He turned, and his eyes found hers with the directness she felt in her sternum. You are more valuable than anything in this archive. It was said the way he said everything, like a fact, like something that had been assessed and found to be true, and was therefore worth stating. She did not know what to say. "Thank you," she said. "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in years." Something moved in his face, so brief she might have imagined it, that looked unexpectedly like pain. Chapter 6. The Naming of Things. The council took a formal dinner on the 5th night, and the king's household attended. Soulweaver had not been included in previous formal gatherings. She was, technically, a bondservant, and Maret had never required it. But on the afternoon of the dinner, Maret arrived in the archive doorway, holding a deep green dress and wearing an expression that dared Soulweaver to ask questions. "The king's formal household attends," Maret said. "Archive keeper is formal household." She had been promoted, quietly, without ceremony, sometime in the last 6 weeks. The dress fit as though it had been made for her. She sat at the lower table and watched Draveth at the head of the room, distant, formal, processing the theatrical posturing of Kaskin and Fennery, and Vrals with his characteristic still attention. He looked once in her direction and looked away before she could respond, but she had seen the look long enough now to know what it carried. Froldt saw the look, too. He made his move over the second course, loudly, with the confidence of a man who believed cruelty and power were synonymous. "Interesting table arrangement," he announced to the room. "I see the King's Archive girl has joined us for dinner. Quite the ascent for a wolfless bond-servant." The laughter from his entourage was prompt and practiced. "Tell me, girl, do you perform other household services for the king, or is it exclusively the literary kind?" The room went very quiet. Soulweaver set down her fork with extreme precision. She was aware of her own heartbeat and, beneath it, something else, something she had never felt before, a pressure behind her eyes, a heat in her chest, expanding. "My name," she said very clearly into the silence, "is Soulweaver Ashvile. I am the archive keeper of Thornvast Keep." The heat in her chest was extraordinary, spreading to her hands, her spine. "I have catalogued 2 centuries of treaty correspondence and cross-referenced the 16 villages the council has spent 4 decades pretending do not exist. I know exactly who fed and housed the Alliance army in the last night of the Pale War, while packlords counted their gold." She looked directly at Vralt. "I know which of those packlords' families signed the supply contract that made the Pale Army possible in the first place." A beat. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me about it." Dead silence. And then, the heat behind her eyes became a roar, a fracture of light across her vision, a presence inside her chest, enormous and patient and ancient, like something that had been sleeping for 22 years and had simply decided in this moment to wake up. Her wolf, not absent, never absent, waiting. Soulweaver gripped the table edge, breathing through it. The impossible, expanding fullness of a self she had been told she didn't have. It did not burst out of her. It arrived like a tide, filling the space of her quietly and completely, and then stilling, settled, hers. She looked up. Draveth was on his feet, His expression was not readable to the rest of the room. To her, in this new, doubled clarity, it was simple. It was wonder. Chapter 7. Roots and Recognition. The keep healer, a bright-eyed woman named Thessaly, who asked sharp questions and accepted nothing at face value, examined Soulweaver the next morning. Late manifestation, Thessaly said, making notes. Unusual but documented. More common in wolves who experienced significant suppression environments in youth. She looked up. Suppression can be external, chronic diminishment, an environment structured to tell someone, continuously, that they are less than they are. She met Soulweaver's eyes. Your wolf was there. She simply could not find enough air. Soulweaver sat with that for a long time. She thought of the house in Duskfen. She thought of Rennick's flat, patient voice informing her, every day in small and large ways, that she was lucky to have even what little she had. She thought of Dresla's inventory of her failures. She thought of Velith's relief when the cart came. The monster at the door is never the one you should fear. They had opened the door to Thornvast. They had wrapped her in rope and driven her to the monster, and found her a room with a latch, and a key to an archive, and clean air to breathe in. She was sitting in the archive when Dreveth came, earlier than usual. He sat across from her, not at the opposite wall, but at the same table, and he placed his hands flat on the wood and looked at her. I owe you a truth, he said. 2, perhaps. She waited. Your bond contract. He reached into his coat and set a folded document on the table. It was her servitude bond, the paper Rennick had signed. Across it, in dark ink, was a single word, witnessed and sealed, void. It was voided the evening of the first week. Before. He stopped, started again. Before I decided to come back to the archive. She looked at the paper. You voided my contract and let me stay. I gave you the choice to stay. You had a room with a latch. You could have left. She looked up. I didn't know the contract was void. I should have told you. That is the first truth I owe you. His jaw tightened. That particular tightening she had learned meant he was finding precise words for something that resisted them. The second. I know what it is to be made small by those who should have protected you. My council spent 40 years erasing 16 villages from the history of this alliance, because crediting them would diminish the Lord's own stories. He looked down at his hands. I let them. I kept the correspondence in the archive, and did not act on it, and told myself it was complex, that the moment wasn't right, that politics required patience. His voice was precise and merciless, about himself. It required courage. I was lacking it. The room was very still. You had the courage, she said, to come back to the archive. He met her eyes. You had the courage to make it worth coming back to. She thought about the compass on her windowsill, the cracked face, the needle that pointed nowhere. She thought about arriving through those gates, alone, with nothing, and the night she had slept deeply for the first time in 2 years. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, I would like to ask you, plainly, and without any contract between us, if you would stay. He held her gaze. Not as archive keeper. As... The slight pause was the most human thing she had ever seen in his face. I do not know your wolf. I know you, and I... A breath. Would very much like to know both. She felt her wolf stir in her chest, warm and curious, turning toward him like a compass finding north for the very first time. Yes, she said. I'll stay. Chapter 8. What the monster owed the world winter arrived at Thornvast with ceremony. Deep snow on the black pines, silence of a quality that felt like permission. Draveth called the full council in the last moon of winter. Not the seasonal 3-lord gathering. Every pack-lord of the Alliance, summoned to Thornvast. They came uncertain, reading the tone of the summons. Formal, unignorable, bearing the king's full seal. He made Soulweaver stand beside him. not behind him, not at the lower table. She wore deep green again. She had come to think of it as her color, the color of the archive, of growing things in stone. And she held a folder of documents she had spent 3 weeks compiling with a precision that would survive any legal challenge. Every source cited, every cross-reference traced, every name of every person from the 16 villages who had made a choice that turned a war, documented, dated, unambiguous. Draveth spoke first. He spoke for 40 minutes, and the council hall grew quieter with every word. Then he nodded to her. Soulweaver spoke for 20 minutes, and she did not raise her voice once. She named every village. She named every family. She named every pack lord whose family fortune had been built on the supply contract that fed the enemy. She presented the documentation in bound copies, one per lord, and watched them read. Vrowl tried to interrupt twice. The Alpha King's silence, directed at him, was the kind that had reportedly ended wars. The formal recognition passed. It was not a close vote. After, in the corridor outside the council hall, Vrowl passed her. He did not speak. He did not have the expression of a man who had been defeated. He had the expression of a man who was recalculating, which she considered more useful. It suggested he understood that the world had changed in a way that could not be unchanged. Marit found her an hour later and handed her a revised household ledger, open to a page with her name. Her title read, Consort Designate and Alliance Archivist. Soulweaver looked at it for a long time. Then she went to find Draveth, and she told him she would like the title to simply read Soulweaver Thornvast, and he smiled, a full, real smile that she had never seen at full extension before, and it was, she thought, like finding a room in a keep you'd thought you'd fully mapped. He told her she could have whatever she wanted. She told him she wanted a ceremony small enough that she could actually hear everyone in it. They were married in the courtyard, in the snow, among the dark, stubborn flowers, with Marit and Thessaly, and the archive staff as witnesses, and the 16 villages of the borderlands formally reinstated to the historical record by sunrise. Epilogue. 1 year later. The monster at the door is never the one you should fear. Fear the hand that opens it, and bless the door that leads somewhere worth finding. The addition was Soulweaver's own. She had spent the year turning it over, the way you turn something in your hands to find its whole shape, and she thought her grandmother had only told half of it. The courtyard in late autumn was full of the dark flowers again, and also of a low table bearing documents, a pot of tea, and a brass compass. She had taken it from the windowsill in her old room on the day she moved her things to the King's, the Alpha King's, her husband's, quarters, and she had set it on their shared desk, where it caught the morning light. He had not asked her about it for 2 months, which was how she knew he had noticed it immediately. When he finally asked, she told him what it was. Her mother's, cracked, pointing nowhere. He took it carefully in his large hands, and he examined it with the same thoroughness he brought to old documents, and then he asked a craftsman in the keep if it could be repaired. It could. The hairline crack across the face was sealed, the mechanism inside cleaned and reset. The needle now pointed true north, unwavering. But he had given it back to her and said, or you could leave it as it was. She had thought about it. She had kept it repaired. Not because the broken version was less valuable, because the working one would let her find her way home from anywhere she wandered. She was not lost anymore, but she liked knowing she had the tools. Draveth came into the courtyard, carrying 2 more cups of tea, a domesticity she would never not find quietly astonishing in a man who had ended a war, and sat beside her at the low table. He looked at the compass. Working? He asked. True north. She turned it in her hands, feeling the familiar weight, the warmth of the brass. I want to take it when we go to the borderland villages. The formal journey to the 16 villages had been planned for the moon's end. Soulweaver's design, seconded by Draveth, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that recognition without presence was still an abstraction. They would go in person. They would sit at tables and eat food and hear names. It had already caused significant pearl-clutching among Vralt's faction, who could not fathom an Alpha King who traveled to small places as though small places mattered. Small places mattered enormously. She had come from one. "Marit wants to join us," Dreveth said. "Of course she does." He looked sideways at her, and she looked back, and there was something in the autumn light and the dark flowers and the weight of the compass in her hand. Something complete. A year of building and learning and fighting and resting and knowing all the way through that this was real, that this man beside her was real, that she was real and present and seen. She had been sold to a monster and found a door instead. Behind it, an archive and a latch she could throw herself, and a man who had learned, same as her, that the truly frightening thing was not claws or silence or power. It was a world that looked at a person and decided, without evidence, what they were worth. They had decided otherwise, both of them, together. She tucked the compass into her coat, over her heart. "Ready?" he asked. She stood, and the courtyard wind moved her hair, and somewhere in her chest her wolf lifted her nose to the cold autumn air and breathed in everything. The pines and the frost and the distant borderland road, and the warmth of the man beside her, and the whole, wide, true north world. "I've been ready," she said, "for quite some time, so